And welcome back to Law and Crime Live. I'm your host this afternoon, Caroline Polisi, and I'm joined in studio today with Misty Marris, Law and Crime trial analyst. Misty, thank you for being here with us today. So we're live in the courtroom of the Tex McIver trial. We're listening to the lead detective on this case, Darren Smith. He's a prosecution witness, Misty, but he's not doing any favors for the prosecution, I have to say. What's your initial take?
Well, right now the focus is obviously on those initial interrogation with Tex and Mary Jo Carter. That's the critical testimony here. You actually have an eyewitness to this incident, so that is going to be the focus of what we're going to hear from the lead detective. And we're also hearing a little bit about the gun discharge now, so things are really heating up, and we're getting this evidence on the record.
Right, and the gun discharge, we're going to sort of go over that and break it down for our viewers, because that is a key element of this case. Obviously, the question is, was this intentional murder or was this an accident, as Tex McIver and his defense team would have us believe, and the jury believe? That's the one issue here. But you know, this detective, 18 years of experience, they can't get him to say that this was intentional.
No.
Misty, hold that thought. I do want to get your thoughts on it when we come back. We're going to have to take a quick break. When we come right back, we're going to get live into that courtroom of the Tex McIver trial out of Georgia. Thanks for watching.
You continued to work that day on this case, correct?
That's correct.
And I understood that at 4:37 that afternoon, 4:30 that afternoon, you got a call.
Yes.
You got a call from Tex McIver.
Yes, I did.
You got a call from Tex McIver, not from his lawyer.
From Tex McIver, like you
Yes.
said.
Not from his lawyer.
It was from Tex McIver. It was from no one else. Next question.
But could have been a conference call.
All right, welcome back to Law and Crime Live. I'm your host, Caroline Polisi, and we are live in the courtroom in Tex McIver trial. I'm here joined in studio with Misty Marris, Law and Crime trial analyst, and a very special guest today. We have Joseph Scott Morgan. He's a professor of forensic science and applied forensics at Jacksonville State University. He was also at the medical examiner's office in Atlanta and at the coroner's office in New Orleans prior to his tenure at Atlanta. Joseph, thank you so much for being with us today. I have a lot of questions for you, and thankfully you're here for a while, so we're going to break it down a little bit. But I just want to get your initial impressions. You know a lot more about guns than I do. This man, Tex McIver, stated he was not a gun guy, and yet we saw 44 weapons being hauled into court yesterday for plain view in front of the jurors. What does that mean?
Well, I don't know. I think that I would like to see, if he were a gun guy, I'd like to see how many guns he actually had.
Right.
40 is rather impressive by any standard. I know a lot of people with quite a number of weapons. And so, yeah, I think that that's those two things kind of don't mesh up very well, do they?
They don't.
He's gone out and collected quite a number of weapons over this period of time. So this is going to, I think, to a certain degree, draw into question his veracity.
That's it, Joseph. I hate to cut you off, but we're going to actually go into a break right now. We're going to come back and break it all down. I know you have a special segment for us, and we can't wait.
Object to that, Chief Judge. So we're going to take our lunch break now, folks. I'd like to keep it as short as will work for you all. 45 minutes has been short, and so if that's sort of the bare minimum we can do, let's keep it at 45, but we're in early today, and it'd be great to get in as much as possible. If we keep it at 45, is that sort of humane? Okay, I'm seeing some nods. So let's keep it at 45 minutes, but we'll make it a real 45. Because I know you've been back. We haven't always been able to start up because there have been things we've been working through. So I'll call that 20, what is that? Clocks. 120. If you all can be ready by 120, that's about 45 minutes, I think. We'll try to get started at 120. While you're taking your break, enjoy time together or apart from each other. Don't talk about the case. And we'll see you at 120. Thank you.
All right, for the jury.
All right, we left court on a light note there from Bruce Harvey, the defense attorney in this case for Tex McIver. He said, getting back to your good investigation, talking to Darren Smith, the lead investigator in this case. Of course, there was an objection to that question, and that's, of course, when the judge said, you know what, why don't we break here for lunch? They're going to take a little bit of a shorter lunch break than typical today because court is adjourning a little bit earlier for Good Friday today, around 4 p.m. Court, as a reminder, will be dark next week and picking back up again the following week. I'm joined in studio with Misty Marris, Law and Crime trial analyst. Misty, thanks for being with us.
Yeah, thanks, Caroline. This trial is blowing my mind every step of the way.
We're also here with Joseph Scott Morgan. He's a professor of forensic science and applied forensics at Jacksonville State University. Joseph, thank you for being with us today.
Thank you for having me.
Misty and I are not gun people, okay? And we're not gun people in the way that Tex McIver stated he was not a gun guy. We actually are not gun people, so we're lucky to have you. We're lucky to have you here with us today. I want to start off with sort of a deep dive into the forensics of the ways in which you can help us understand, break it down for sort of the lay person in terms of how this gun went off. Let's talk a little bit, if you could just go over the weapon type, okay? What kind of a weapon are we talking about that was used for, which we know killed Diane McIver in this case?
Yeah, I've actually got an example of a weapon that's closely similar to that Tex McIver. I'm going to show you in just a second, but just so that the folks at home understand, this is a .38 Special pistol. It's a revolver. It's not like you commonly see on television that has a slide and that sort of thing. This is not a semi-automatic pistol. This cylinder, it has a cylinder and it actually revolves around. You can see it detailed there in that image. And so every time you pull that trigger and what's referred to as double action mode, that cylinder will spin to the next available live cartridge.
Okay.
So here before me, I have a weapon that is very similar to the one that McIver had in the vehicle. Now, folks at home might notice that this is a bit different than a regular pistol that you might see traditionally. And what sets this thing apart is the fact that it has what's referred to as a shrouded hammer. And this is key in this particular case because what they're stating is that this weapon accidentally discharged.
Right.
Let's talk about this just for a second. This is a dummy weapon that we use at Jacksonville State to train our students in crime scene investigation. And you can see this, it's actually got a spur hammer on it. This is a big difference between that and the shrouded hammer. The shrouded hammer is meant to be a pocket pistol, easily concealed. You can't see it. It's very lightweight, and it doesn't catch on your clothing when you pull it out. You can actuate it by pulling it back and firing it in single shot mode. And this is where the discrepancy comes in. They're saying that the pistol took 2 pounds of pressure to pull. That's only if the hammer is pulled back. It takes 12 pounds of pressure if you try to initiate it just by pulling the trigger, and the weapon has to actuate the hammer itself. This is a huge delineation, Carolyn, because my question is, why would you have the hammer back on this weapon driving down the road? And they're saying that they hit this bump, this mysterious bump, and the weapon discharged and essentially struck Miss McIver in her back, transecting her body.
Right. So the question is whether or not, do we know for sure whether or not it was the 2 pound amount of force or the 12 pound amount of force that was going to be necessary to discharge this weapon?
Yeah, that is the big question.
Yeah.
I can tell you that if you're attempting if the defense is putting forth that this thing was not cocked back, I cannot imagine in my wildest fantasies a weapon just spontaneously firing from a bump in a road that requires 12 pounds of trigger pressure. That's a tremendous amount of pressure. I would demonstrate it with this here, but we have the cylinder locked back for safety purposes.
Of course.
It's very difficult to do, even for a grown man that has strong hands and this sort of thing. It's not easy to do unless this thing has been fiddled with in some way to decrease the amount of trigger pressure, but still it takes substantial pressure to apply to make this thing actually actuate.
Okay, and yet we heard from an investigator on the stand a few days ago who accidentally did do something that would have involuntarily discharged the weapon. Am I right? Explain that for me and for viewers.
Yeah, I'm not sure how he went about doing it. And if I remember correctly, and I might be way off base here, I think this was actually a firearms examiner.
That's right.
That initiated this thing. This is a guy that works with guns every single day. I don't know if he had the hammer back and he was trying to demonstrate this thing or not. He had a lock. I saw he had a lock on that cylinder just like I have. Now, you can kind of flick it forward if you just pull it back, and it might give people the impression that the thing is engaging, but it's not locked all the way back.
Joseph, I'm sorry, I'm going to have to interrupt you there. We're going to have to throw to commercial break, but I definitely want to continue this conversation when we come back on Law and Crime Live. Welcome back to Law and Crime Live. Court is on a lunch break in the case of the Tex McIver murder trial out of Georgia. And again, court will be adjourning early today in recognition of the Good Friday holiday, and court is dark next week. So we have a lot to cover in this next few hours of court. That court is in session. And I'm joined in studio with Misty Marris, Law and Crime trial analyst. Misty, thanks for being with us.
Thanks, Caroline.
And Joseph Scott Morgan, professor of forensic science and applied forensics at Jacksonville State University. Joseph, thank you for being with us. So, you two, we have been discussing the sort of nitty-gritty in terms of the breaking down how this could have happened. Of course, the theory that the defense would have us all believe is that this was an accidental discharge of a gun, that Tex was aroused from a sleep behind in the backseat of this car in this bad neighborhood. They were either, according to one story, they were at a stoplight. According to another, they hit a bump and this gun discharged. And the question we all want to know is that actually possible? Could that have happened? What I want to show our viewers now is a clip of the testimony of Zachary Weitzel, and he's going to break down, he was on the stand yesterday, giving us some information just about this gun and about how this all could have played out. We're going to talk about it on the flip side, so take a listen.
Expert took the stand in the murder trial of prominent Atlanta attorney Claude Tex McIver. McIver claims the shooting death of his wife, Diane McIver, was an accident. The defense contends the gun accidentally fired while McIver handled it in the back seat of the SUV he and his wife were riding in, striking and fatally injuring Diane. The prosecution contends it was no accident and the defendant had financial motives for the killing. Firearms expert Zachary Weitzel took the stand and demonstrated the difference between single action and double action.
There's a single action notch on the bottom of the hammer, and then there is a corresponding ledge, so to speak, on the top of the trigger. It's just a very slight movement. Were you able to see? So with double action, you see that the trigger is now set further back. Okay, so from there, I would have to pull the trigger up all the way. So about to there is as far as I can stage it without the hammer falling. But then from this, it's almost the same distance as the single action, but it would have to travel this full distance to fire.
And called into question the defendant's story of accidentally shooting his wife while handling the gun.
This firearm, if I just hold it in my hands like this, will it just go off?
No.
If I sit down with it and hold it down here in my lap, will it just go off?
No.
If I handle it like this in any way, will it just go off?
No.
What will make this firearm go off?
Something would have to act on the trigger.
And when you say something has to act on the trigger, what do you mean?
I mean, the trigger has to be pulled rearward.
But on cross-examination, the defense attorney made it clear that firearms can be unintentionally discharged.
As opposed to an accidental discharge, there is something that you know of that's called an unintentional discharge, correct?
Right.
And an unintentional discharge means that one can put pressure on the trigger unintentionally and that the weapon can discharge, correct?
Right.
For a number of reasons, including being startled, correct?
Right.
And again, this weapon, as well as any other weapons, can be unintentionally discharged, correct?
It can be.
Did McIver intentionally shoot his wife for financial gain, or was this just an unfortunate accident? I'm Rachel Stockman for Law&Crime.
All right, you heard it there. Can a gun be unintentionally discharged? That was Zachary Weitzel, prosecution witness and a firearms expert. I'm joined again in studio with Misty Marris and Joseph Scott Morgan. Misty, I know you had a few questions, picking up on our conversation that we left off before the last commercial break, but I'm confused. Can Joseph, can you help us?
Yeah, we need help, Joseph, because I'll say, from my perspective, the experts in this case have said, we can't tell if this gun was shot intentionally. We cannot make a conclusion about whether or not it's intentional or not, which is the multi-million-dollar question here. That's what matters. So this issue of the pressure on the trigger, that seems to be critical. Can you tell us about that? Because I know I'm confused.
Yeah, and it all does come down to trigger pressure, Misty. The idea that, and remember, let's reflect back to what the expert said. He said that this weapon cannot discharge unless the trigger is actuated. Even Bruce Harvey repeated that. He just stated that the trigger can be unintentionally pulled. It's not like the thing has a mechanical malfunction. It has to be pulled. Even he's saying that it has to be pulled. So the key is the trigger and how much pressure was applied. One of the things that has always left me scratching my head about this case, and I've been covering this for a while now, is this idea that he's in this neighborhood where he is allegedly very terrified, but yet he's asleep. And he's startled, and he hits a bump, and all these other things that kind of domino, it seems like, and it leaves the waters quite murky, if you will.
Right, and that's one of those issues where you look and say, well, maybe that impacts his credibility and doesn't really pass the test of common sense, forgetting the legal standards. But one important distinction in what you just said, Joseph, that I want to flag for our audience is, look, yes, there's a difference between intentionally discharging the weapon and the fact that pressure has to be applied to the trigger in order for it to discharge. So those are two different things. Now, presumably, the defense is going to say, look, it was cocked for whatever reason. Only 2 pounds of pressure needed to be exerted as opposed to 12. But can you tell us, we don't know what it's like to hold that gun, the difference between 2 and 12. Is that a really big difference? Will that make or break this case?
Yeah, it's significantly different. You saw how easy he actuated that weapon when it was already cocked earlier in his demonstration. That is the firearms examiner.
Well, Joseph, I hate to break in again, but I would like to play that actually for our viewers. Sure. We have a clip, and it's pretty subtle, so I want you guys to pay close attention. This is Zachary Weitzel. He's on the stand. He's a firearm expert, and he accidentally discharges the gun. This guy is a firearms expert testifying to the fact that it couldn't be accidentally discharged. It's an amazing moment, and we caught it. Take a look.
They're designed not to work in that case. If the gun is in single action, so with the hammer cocked, it's primed, it's ready to be fired. The only way that the gun will fire is if the trigger is pulled and then held to the rear long enough for the hammer to fall. So if you were to pull the trigger, but then release the trigger, and I'll put my finger here so that I could feel it if it went through, it doesn't touch. Because you notice the trigger actually moves forward with the hammer if I don't physically depress it.
Oops. What's going on there, Joseph? What's happening?
Off of the hammer itself and accidentally discharged the weapon and had it back. So, but again, is McIver riding down the road with the weapon. You can't really partially cock it, but you can kind of hold it back with your thumb. But that would take tremendous amount of hand strength. So the only thing I can think of is that potentially he's riding down the road with a cocked weapon. That means that this is, as we say in law enforcement and in the military, that's a hot weapon. It's actually ready to fire. And he has this thing already back, and then trigger pressure is applied. And remember, it only takes 2 pounds. It doesn't take a tremendous amount. And so, yeah, it's quite possible. Even the expert made the thing fire, and it was unintentional, per that demonstration.
Right, and we know, I mean, so the story goes that they were sort of on high alert. Tex felt that this was not the best part of town. Of course, that doesn't really add up with the fact that he was dozing off to sleep at the same time. So there's so many different sort of stories here. The inconsistencies are just piling on. We're going to talk about it, break it down a little bit more for you when we come back on Law and Crime Live. You won't want to miss a second. We'll be back in court live in the case of Tex McIver. Welcome back to Law and Crime Live. I'm your host, Caroline Polisi, and court is on the lunch break in the Tex McIver trial, murder trial out of Georgia. I'm joined in studio with Misty Marris, Law and Crime trial analyst, and on Skype, Joseph Scott Morgan, forensic death analyst. Now, guys, we've been getting into the nitty-gritty here, and I want to close the loop on what we were talking about before we went to a break. Misty, do you want to pick back up on that?
Absolutely. So we just saw an expert for the prosecution accidentally discharge a firearm. So if I'm sitting there in the jury box, I'm saying, if this guy who's prepared and ready to testify and is an expert with firearms can accidentally discharge the gun, why couldn't Tex? And that, my friends, is reasonable doubt. And if I'm the defense attorney, you hear that at my closing.
And I think that another thing is, I wonder how hard Harvey hammered on that. Did he pick up on that and drive that home relative to the expert? And yeah, I think that that's a salient point, and it is possible. It's not outside the realm of possibility that this could have happened, but still, this leaves us with this big idea. Why is he driving down the road, or why is he riding down the road with this weapon cocked? And if he knows so much about weapons, why does he have a cocked weapon sitting in his lap pointing directly at the back of his wife? He says he's not a weapons guy, but he has 40 weapons that he owns. Certainly, he knows something about weapons. And so this thing is actually pointed at her back, presumably cocked, because you would have to actuate it that way, driving down the road, and hits a bump and the thing discharges. It really leaves me scratching my head.
Such a good point, Joseph. And, you know, Tex, by all accounts, was sort of a gun safety fanatic, right? He taught gun safety to others. Yes. He was very vocal about that. So it really doesn't add up, as you stated, why he would be in this position in the first place. Of course, I guess the alternate answer would be that, you know, he was kind of in and out of a dreamlike state. He fell asleep. He was I don't know. I guess that would be the counter argument. I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about the bullets in this case. If you could sort of clarify for our viewers, just give us a rundown of what types of bullets were used here.
Yeah, the 38 Special is a type of ammo that's been around for years and years. And here at the Center for Applied Forensics at Jacksonville State, we took some images of a couple of 38 rounds. If you take a look at the one on the right that has kind of the silver end on it, that's what we refer to as standard ball ammunition. There it is on the right again. That means that it's just essentially a chunk of lead, and that's the projectile that comes out of the weapon. The one on the left that's got that kind of copper color, that's what's referred to as a hollow point. So when that weapon deploys, when it opens up after it hits the point of impact, that round actually spreads like this, and it's got little points on it, and it increases stopping power, essentially. I don't particularly care for that term, but it's a term that it transfers the inertial energy into that body over a greater space. So it kind of, you know, grabs hold of the tissue, allegedly knocks the person down, and of course it can do more damage. They've talked about two types of ammunition that were with the weapon. If I remember correctly, I think they did have standard ball and they did have hollow point. And this is a kind of a powerful round, but, you know, people at home that hear about bullets and all this sort of thing, It's almost the same size as a 9mm. It's on a different measurement scale. This is what we call the old English system, 38, as opposed to a 9mm. And so the sizes are kind of crazy for people that are not around weapons quite a bit. But it has been used for personal defense for years and years. As a matter of fact, police departments all over the country, up until probably the early 80s, even the FBI carried 38 special ammunition in their revolvers. And of course, after that, departments all over the country went to semi-automatic handguns, Glocks and Smith & Wessons and all that sort of thing.
Interesting. So, Joseph, thank you for that analysis. I want to show our viewers now a clip of Michael Knox. He's a crime scene reconstructionist. And the question, of course, that we're all asking is whether or not this gun was fired cocked or not cocked, because, of course, that goes to the question of whether or not this was an intentional murder or an unintentional tragic accident. So I want to take a listen to some of this testimony here, and we can all circle back afterwards to sort of break it down.
Action meaning hammer's not cocked, you pull the trigger, and as you pull the trigger, the hammer moves back until it finally releases. Single action meaning you cock the hammer first and then pull the trigger. Sometimes, not every time, but sometimes the depth of the firing pin impression in the primer of the cartridge is different for single action versus double action. So what we can do is measure the depth of the firing pin impression in a fired cartridge case involved in a shooting. And then we can take a sample, take a particular firearm, fire it single action a certain number of times, fire it double action a certain number of times, and then look at the depths measured for each one of the samples and then see whether or not they're different. And if they're different, whether or not we can tell if the impression made by the incident cartridge, the one that was actually fired in the actual shooting, can be distinguished between one or the other based on that depth. So that was the test firing that I did the second time that I came up.
Okay. And can you tell the jury what were the results of that test if you did?
What actually ended up happening is that the two different modes produced very similar.
All right, that was Michael Knox. He was a crime scene reconstructionist you heard there. I'm joined with Joseph Scott Morgan. He's a forensic death analyst. So, Joseph, I didn't really understand that, to tell you the truth. But I think the issue is whether or not this gun was discharged cocked or not cocked, and why does that matter?
On the other screens, or
well, it matters because that goes to the idea that the defense is putting forth that this is an accidental discharge, going back to our weapon that we had before, what he did was take this weapon and pull the hammer. I'm going to rotate this so that you can see what I'm talking about. This is called a shrouded hammer. He pulled it all the way back. Ours is locked back, so we can't actuate it fully. We're not going to make the mistake that the guy did. But this is pulled all the way back, and once it's back to this point, they would then pull the trigger right here to see how many pounds of pressure, as opposed to having it all the way forward and then pulling the trigger like this to see how many pounds of pressure. In other words, their test was inconclusive. They couldn't delineate between single action and double action. So that kind of leaves the whole thing up in the air, and quite interesting, as a matter of fact. One other point along the way, what he's talking about, the pin. If you look, this is the base of a bullet. I'm going to try to bring it in a little bit closer. I'm sorry, this is Skype, so it's a little bit more difficult. Do you see the inner ring there?
Yep.
That's the primer. That's what has to be struck when the hammer goes forward. When that's struck, the explosion sequence initiates, the primer discharges, and then it hits the propellant in here, and then this chrome, this brass-looking part right here, which is actually the projectile of the bullet, exits out of the casing downrange, and the bullet is fired at that point in time. So it's a specific sequence that it goes through.
Okay. Joseph Scott Morgan, everyone, professor of forensic science and applied forensics at Jacksonville State University. Thank you so much for being with us today. I would hope you would stick around maybe for a few more tidbits of analysis for us. Misty Marris, thank you for joining us in studio. We're going to take another break, but court is on lunch break in the case of Tex McIver in Atlanta, Georgia, everyone. And we'll be back in just a minute. Again, court is ending early today at 4 p.m., so we've got a lot of testimony to cover in the next couple of hours. Should go back live into that courtroom in just about 10 minutes. So we'll catch you on the flip side after this commercial break. You're watching Law and Crime. Welcome back to Law and Crime Live. I'm your host, Caroline Polisi, and we are in the middle of a heated discussion with Joseph Scott Morgan, forensic death analyst, and Misty Marris, Law and Crime trial analyst. We were talking about the Tex McIver trial. Was it murder or was it an accident? And we have Joseph Scott Morgan here to break it all down for us in terms of the forensics of how this gun may or may not have been accidentally discharged. Now, the one thing I want to talk about that I don't think we've gotten to yet, Joseph, or two things actually, but the first is the trajectory of the gun. Can you tell us a little bit about that topic?
Things that they're contending, and every reconstructionist model that I've seen thus far, there was a big write-up in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution yesterday, and they had screen captures of this thing. He's holding the weapon in his right hand. That means the top of his right thigh, and that what they're saying is that in forensics terms, we talk about the relationship of the projectile as it travels through the air. Is it going from left to right? In this case, they're saying that it's going from right to left. It looks like it's going from slightly above to below, and obviously from front to back. And this is going to go across her midline of her body. This means that this would have traveled very, very close to her spinal column and then exited out of her left, probably upper or lower quadrant, I would imagine. If people at home can sun your abdomen and you place your hand essentially where your spleen would be, or down from there a little bit, it would have exited in those two areas, or closely approximating that area. And then the projectile would have lodged somewhere in the cabin. And this is important. Because, one of the things I'm sure that the prosecution is going to talk about, if they're saying that he intentionally did this, intent would give us an impression that he would have, if you're out to kill somebody, that you would have taken that weapon and essentially jammed it into the back of that seat as close as you possibly can and pulled the trigger.
Right.
But in that particular attitude that they have him in, that weapon's resting in his lap, Carolyn. And so it's traversing through the back of that seat and then striking her body.
Right.
And that doesn't give it much purpose, like this intent, and, which they talk about a lot in court. And we have to think about, because of trajectory, what's going to affect it? Well, she's seated, obviously, in the seat of this vehicle, and that's what, in forensics, we refer to that as an intermediate target. So as that bullet, and remember we talked about hollow point rounds just a moment ago, as that bullet strikes the back of that seat, those little talons will essentially deploy, and it will create this kind of nasty cavitation as it goes through the seat, if that is in fact what type of ammo that was used, and then it strikes her body. So you're going to get kind of a unique looking entrance wound and potentially exit wound on her body. That's what makes this case so compelling.
Yeah.
You can see the interior of that seat. It has to pass through a lot of gizmos in that seat. There's all kinds of wiring and metal boxes and all kinds of things like that. So it's going to actually affect the flight of the bullet.
Right. Such a good point to bring in, that element of intent. And it makes perfect sense. Yes, if this were an intentional murder, you would think he would put it right up against the back of that seat. But, just when I think that I've landed on a theory of this case, something like this comes to mind, and I think, well, yeah, you're right. I mean, why would there be the gap between? Why wouldn't he have put it right up against the seat? So it's a great point. Thank you for pointing that out to us. I want to show viewers one more clip of Michael Knox. He's a crime scene reconstructionist. We heard from him on the stand, and he's going to break down a little bit more of the forensic for us. We're going to talk about it when we get back.
Well, what you're doing with crime scene reconstruction is applying various types of science to be able to look at physical evidence and then compare that to the event. So in some cases, the physical evidence might show you something definitive in and of itself. Some cases, what you're doing is using physical evidence to compare to, say, an account of how something occurred and determine whether it could have happened based on the physical evidence or could not have happened. So it's a matter of applying different types of science depending on what you're looking at. For example, a trajectory, the trajectory rod, you're looking at the physics and mechanics of how that firearm, that bullet would travel from the firearm through the seat. And it doesn't. We know it doesn't turn corners. It doesn't do things like that. It's going to travel over a short distance, what is roughly a straight line. And so the firearm would have to follow that straight line. So that's what we're applying for that.
Make sure everybody keep up.
And luckily, there's only one screen, so we're all going to be good. So, Mr. Dustin, can you explain to the jury what they are looking at as the video plays?
Correct. So what this is where we have we've created the 3D models of the seats based on the laser scan data, and then we have inserted the characters, and this was done under the direction of Mr. Michael Knox, as well as the trajectory rod was also captured in the laser scan.
All right, you're watching Law&Crime Live. Joseph Scott Morgan is here with us. He's professor of forensic science and applied forensics at Jacksonville State University. Joseph, thank you so much for being with us here today. I know you have to run, but can you dispense any final thoughts? I know you had a tidbit of information you felt like you wanted to share.
Yeah, going back to the positionality of the weapon in Mr. McIver's lap, this is... I look at this and I think about the lethality, the level of or potential lethality. We know that all weapons are dangerous, and we assume that all weapons are loaded. But the level of lethality, what are the chances that if you're going to attempt to perpetrate malice murder, which is what they're calling this in Georgia, what are the chances that you're going to be able to score a kill shot from the rear of a seat firing that low on a body? It's not necessarily a 1 in a million shot, but it's not the typical location that you would go for if you were attempting to out and out kill somebody, like shooting them directly behind in the shoulder blades, the shoulder blades, or putting the weapon up to the back of their head. We're talking about a trajectory that's relatively low on the body. You're away from the heart and the lungs. And so if you clip anything that's vital, it's a long shot that the person will die. Again, this goes back into this idea, if they had gone to Grady or to Atlanta Medical Center, which was closer, could they have saved her life? Because eventually she died from blood loss, Carolyn.
Right.
It's not like he hit her in the head or shot her in the head.
Very good points, as always. Joseph Scott Morgan, thank you for being with us today. Thank you for your expertise. We are heading back into the courtroom live of the Tex McIver trial. I'm joined here in studio with Misty Marris. Misty, you and I are not, as familiar with guns as Joseph Scott Morgan, our guest, was. What did you take away from what he just told us?
I thought what he told us was very informative. He's the expert, but what I know about trials, why did this lead detective not ask any of those questions about the gun placement when Tex McIver was arrested in the initial interview?
Right.
It's crazy. So Joseph Scott Morgan just told us all of the factors that you need to know to make a conclusion about whether or not this was intentional or not intentional, or what would factor into that in making that decision. And the lead detective didn't ask how he was holding the gun, where the gun was placed. These are huge prosecution problems.
Right.
The other piece is this accident reconstruction, that's the prosecution's reconstruction, doesn't really seem to support their theory of the case.
That's right.
As Joseph Scott Morgan said, if you want to hit that kill shot, you're not going to take the chance that that's not going to be in the right place.
Right.
So,
Misty Marris, everyone, always good insights. We're going to a commercial break. When we come back, we're going to go back live into the courtroom of Tex McIver. You won't want to miss a second.